Canada screwed up big time, and my friend Tristin Hopper wrote a book about that. He will join us in moments. Also, Mitch Case from the Métis Nation of Ontario about what negotiations over resource projects actually mean. This is On the Line. This message is brought to you by the Métis Nation of Ontario. For generations, Métis communities in Ontario helped build Canada's first great economy, the fur trade. They were fur traders, farmed river lots, raised families, and built communities. They petitioned governments and fought for their rights in courtrooms. In 1993, they mobilized, founding the Métis Nation of Ontario as their government to represent their interests and protect their future. In 2003, their rights were affirmed by the Supreme Court, and in 2023, Canada formally recognized the MNO as the Métis Government of Métis people and communities in Ontario. Now, with a newly elected federal government, it's time to write the next chapter together. The MNO is calling on Prime Minister Mark Carney and his government to advance the government-to-government relationship with the MNO, address the outstanding historic Métis claims and broken promises made to Métis communities at Sault Ste. Marie and in northwestern Ontario, work with Métis governments to improve access to healthcare, mental health supports, and addiction services for Métis people, and expand investments in Métis housing, education, and infrastructure. Generations of strong Métis leadership in Ontario have led to this moment. It is time for Prime Minister Carney to get it done. Learn more at OntarioMétisFacts.com. Hey, everybody, it's Matt Gurney. This is another episode of On the Line, and I'm going to confess something to you guys right away. Barring any, airline disasters, I am now in Europe. And if there was an airline disaster, well, thanks for tuning in and stuff. It's been great. But no, look, I'm planning on being vacation for the next couple of weeks, and I wanted to still get you guys an episode. I know you guys look forward to this. And I thought this was a great opportunity to have a couple of conversations I've been looking forward to having, but that aren't going to be as dependent on everything that is happening every day in the news. So while I am off touring new countries and drinking new drinks and having new food, I want you to enjoy this conversation with my friend and colleague, Tristin Hopper. Tristin is a columnist and a reporter at the National Post. Many years ago, a depressing number of years ago, he was the comment section intern, and he was a very smart kid. He didn't just do good work for us. He brought us dessert every day. Cakes, pies, treats. The kid knew what he was doing even then. Tristin, now an author of a new book on what went wrong in Canada in recent years. He's going to tell us all about it in just a couple of minutes. So enjoy my conversation with Tristin Hopper. Well, I am excited for this interview. I'm looking forward to it. We just had a little bit of a gab session off the air because I actually haven't talked to him in a while, but it's Tristin Hopper, old friend and colleague from the National Post, where he is now a reporter and columnist based out west in BC. But for the purposes of today's interview, he is the author of Don't Be Canada, How One Country Did Everything Wrong All at Once. So Tristin, I actually have I have a question I'm really excited to ask you about the book, but I think we have to punt that a little bit. First of all, tell me what the book is and tell me why you decided to write it. What's the origin story there?
The origin story would be one of the things I do at the National Post is I'll just go into Google News and put in the word Canada or Canadian, and I'll just sort of search how we're being mentioned around the world. So just do a total global news search of, instances where someone has mentioned the word Canada. And it's usually a good way. Sometimes you'll find a story that's like doing really well in Indonesia that has a Canadian angle that we haven't covered here in Canada. So it's just a great way to find news stories. And it was me noticing that the way Canada was being mentioned abroad had started to markedly change, particularly in the last few years. So we went from most foreign mentions of Canada would be generally positive or just sort of fun. Like, oh, look at this polar bear.
Polar bear in supermarket,
try to do so only in Canada. And then it shifted very quickly into, on a variety of topics, Canada was now being routinely cited as the worst example of something. So it'd be a story about housing and affordability and saying, well, Canada leads the G7 by far in housing and affordability. And it came up quite a lot in terms of assisted suicide. So I was seeing all across the Anglosphere, you'd see left-wing publications, right-wing publications, all specifically doing profiles about Canada, about how our assisted suicide program, as compared to other assisted suicide programs, had gone off the rails. So it was me noticing that all of these problems that I think were already well known to me were becoming bad enough that they were not only making us an outlier in terms of the rest of the world, but the rest of the world was starting to notice, to the point where I think, for the budget of this book didn't allow me to just fly to random countries and, ask people's impressions of Canada. But I think to the point where people's knee-jerk reactions of what a Canadian is has changed. We assume they're just going to have some, fun joke about free healthcare or whatever. But I think you're much more likely these days, if you're on a cruise, if you're in a European country, you say you're Canadian, their first impulse is going to be, are you really killing your elderly or killing people because they can't afford healthcare? So yeah, that would be the origin story of the book.
It's funny too, because I've noticed the same thing. And I have also noticed, just even in my own travels around the world, I think overall people are still generally well disposed to Canada. And I also think there's a generational divide here. Older people will still be, oh, you have free healthcare, blah, blah, blah. But I have also noticed the whole stereotype of the nice, befuddled, friendly, inoffensive Canadian tourist has been changing. And it happened very quickly. And it's something like, even if we look at now the former Prime Minister, Justin Trudeau, who's around for about 10 years, at the start of his mandate, the foreign press coverage of Canada was fawning. And that was sort of in the Vogue cover era, or whatever magazines he was on, where it was Justin Trudeau, young, fresh, handsome, beautiful family at the forefront of a movement of a country that is hip and cool and progressive. And I don't know exactly when that changed, but it was probably somewhere in the vicinity of sort of the India trip versus, and then kind of we had blackface, and then housing affordability, and veterans show up at their doctor and ask for Tylenol and they're offered suicide instead. And I'm not going to blame all of this stuff on Trudeau. I think that's oversimplifying it. But I think it did all start to happen around the time of blackface. And certainly I think it was pre-pandemic, because when the pandemic came and Canada was basically begging for vaccines, I was already having non-Canadian friends of mine going, well, hey, you can just euthanize each other. I was like, oh, okay, that's a change.
Yeah, or just in terms of the news stories that most people like, you ask someone in a foreign country who maybe isn't coached up on Canadian politics all that much, and you ask them, what's the most recent Canadian news story you've heard? And it's like, well, remember that shop teacher with the giant, prosthetic breasts? That's the one I remember. So but anyway, this book has 8 chapters. And it only got a chapter in the book if it was something in which Canada was uniquely extreme. We are an outlier as compared to the rest of the world, even as compared to our usual sort of wussy peer countries, all the places we usually compare ourselves to, Norway, the Netherlands, blue states. So there's not going to be a chapter in this book about military spending. We've underfunded our military. We do not have good readiness. That's been pretty common across a lot of the Western world. There's not going to be a chapter about we've blown out the budget, because everybody's blown out the budget. The 8 chapters are specific areas in which I could identify that Canada has gone further than anybody else, or has suffered worse consequences than anyone else. So, second only to Portugal, and they're on their way out, we have the worst housing unaffordability in the world. We are the world's, we have the worst, the highest rate of MAID of anywhere else in the world as of this recording. So in terms of just deaths that are attributable to medical assistance and dying, we are the highest in the world. We are the only healthcare system in the world. We have some of the worst wait times of anywhere in the world, even as compared to other countries with socialized medicines. So anyway, the whole book is just filled with, and when people approach me about the book, they say they're quite surprised. They're like, I knew things sucked, but I assumed everyone else was also just handing out drugs to drug addicts and, hoping that would help things, and were confused when it didn't. And I'm saying, no, this is very specifically unique to Canada, and no one else is doing it.
I remember a few years ago, and you and I have spoken about this before. We've spoken about it privately. We've also spoken about it on the air. You were living in Edmonton at the time, and you were loud and proud in a time when this was deeply controversial. It would be much easier for you to be you today than it would have been 5 or 6 years ago, whenever it was you were in Edmonton. But you were one of the first voices to start going, we probably shouldn't have needles in random suburbs. Like there are. I remember you were approached this actually very maturely, and the blowback you got for it, I thought at the time, was insane. Like, it was not actually connected to what you were saying. You weren't saying don't help drug addicts. You weren't saying shut down facilities intended to save lives. You were saying there needs to be some attention given to the consequences of that. There are second order effects of what we're doing here. And then I think for family reasons, then you're in Victoria now, I think, and you were basically running into the same problem. How much
I'm from Victoria. People always say, you wrote a book about how you hate, leftists, and then you moved to leftist land. You hypocrite. Anyway, I have family here. I'm born here. There's other reasons.
How much was the drug element like a part of that decision here? Like, just kind of like when, in terms of you starting to pay attention to this, every book starts with an idea. Where do you think the idea started? Was it what you were seeing on the Google trends, or was it stumbling across needles all over your lawn?
I mean, like anybody, almost any Canadian my age, I've noticed that there has been, a very noticeable decline in Canada. So just the world that I knew, like I'm living in my hometown right now. I know that this parking lot did not have an 8-foot fence with razor wire at the top, because we didn't have to worry about, that parking lot becoming filled with needles or human feces. So yeah, I have, very specifically and directly noticed the decline. So I guess what motivated the book was everybody kind of has this feeling like it feels different, but I don't know if it's nostalgia. So a lot of this book is, and there's huge endnotes to this book, massive endnotes, because I thought nobody would believe me. Because it's me just trying to prove that is not a feeling. In very material senses, Canada has declined often faster than you've imagined. And there are things happening within the governmental system that you probably don't know about. So I'd say the general thesis when I get to the end of this book is what's really surreal about Canada, and is particularly surreal after the federal election, is you will ask people specifically, should we have a system in schools where if a potentially an autistic kid says they feel like they're in the wrong body, what's the best way to go about this? Should we have a program where you immediately have to affirm the transgender identity of this kid, and you get fired if you question that, for a second? Someone will say, no, that's unreasonable. It's an 80-20 issue. So there's any number of polls showing, we don't like the drug disorder. We don't like the extremes of transgender ideology. We don't like the extremes of MAID. But when it comes down to an election, we vote for the exact same parties that have been doing this all along. There's been some demographic changes in the midst. So a lot of these problems, and it's often Canadians will not have a concept of what's happening in their own country. So like in the gender ID, no, not gender ID, the racial politics chapter, I think it's chapter 2. Where I'm just mentioning, and I've heard from quite a few people in my social circle, they'll be applying for a government job, and now what is routine now, they'll ask you, specifics of your race and ethnicity, and they'll say, this is outrageous. This is Canada. We are all the same. We're all colorblind. And I say, no, this is set policy within multiple government institutions, lots of academia. And this is written down. You can go in, and there are, for some government positions like a Canada Research Chair, there are very specific racial and identity quotas that they have to meet. And if they're not meeting them, they have to start advertising jobs only for people of a certain race or identity profile. And I think most people are unaware of this because, again, this is not an anti-Trudeau book. I'm talking about trends that have been in place in Canada for about way more than 10 years at this time. So I would characterize Trudeau as more of a symptom of things that were happening anyway, because they got worse under him, and they're continuing to get worse under his successor. But all of these areas in which we became more extreme than anyone else, a version of it was already germinating before Justin Trudeau was ever prime minister.
I agree with you on that. I think, to the extent that Trudeau is a symptom, I might even say a culmination, like that sort of all like 10, 20 years of social and political forces brought us to the point where we had Justin Trudeau, and where for a time he was deeply popular. And like I mentioned before, deeply popular abroad and deeply popular at home. That was a legitimate, sincere thing. It just didn't last in the face of reality. You mentioned a minute ago being back in your hometown and actually being able to observe change. So I'm a Toronto guy. Grew up in and around Toronto, born in Toronto, grew up in the suburbs. Now I'm living back in the city itself. And one of the really interesting things, and this is purely an anecdote, right? But and this is I'll talk about anecdotes in a minute, but we had to replace our side gate this year, and it was simply because the gate was old and it was falling apart. And then in the winter, we had a nasty storm and some ice fell off the roof, and it basically, the gate was on its last legs, and then it was smashed. Like it was done. So my wife and I are like, all right, let's put that on the spring to-do list. We'll get the gate replaced. And we were looking at designs, talking like kind of paint colors do we want, all these things. And unanimously, without even having to talk about it, my wife and I talked about something for the first time, which is it also has to be secure. It has to be something that we can secure. And we do leave it open most of the time. So the kids can get in or the mailman can get in. But at night, if we want to, we can securely close that gate. And look, anyone who's determined to get through it will get through it. But we have gone through some steps to make it harder for them to do that. And that wouldn't even have occurred to me 5 years ago. And in my neighborhood, people are now like one of the often topics of just chit chat with your neighbors is, hey, where did you get your cameras? Who installed them? There are Facebook groups in the community that basically exist for, hey, car was stolen overnight. Please submit our your Ring camera footage if you happen to catch anything. Right. Things like that. Bollards, driveway bollards. I haven't seen them recently,
I joined all those groups, and then during the federal election, it was months and months and months of the crime's getting worse. Thing and claim, and then as soon as the election came around, they go, oh, we have to vote Liberal again.
Obviously,
elbows up. So. And now they're back to complaining about the crime again. So it's been very surreal for me. I don't know how to get over that. But one thing I try to do to the book is to bring up those contrasts, is to find here's something that's happening, not too long ago compared to what is happening now, just to sort of, give people the bends as to how much. And one great example is in the healthcare chapter, I bring up the death of Brian Sinclair. This was 2008. And this was a double amputee goes into a Winnipeg hospital, and it's something very routine, like a 30-minute procedure. And he is ignored, denied. He's not able to seek care, sits in the waiting room for 35 hours, ends up dying in the waiting room. And they don't find his body for like 4 or 5 hours. I mean, this is a major scandal at the time. Multiple inquiries, official apologies from the Winnipeg government. It has its own Wikipedia page.
Yeah, I remember it. As soon as you said his name, I remembered the case. Yeah.
Yeah. So this was, and it was such an egregious failure because at the time they were saying, there's no reason this needed to happen. We had the capacity. This was an easy procedure to do. We could have seen him. So at the time, this became sort of, Brian Sinclair was Indigenous. They're like, this is such a massive and inconceivable failure of the healthcare system. It's got to be racism because it doesn't make any sense otherwise. And now you take someone dying in a waiting room in a Canadian hospital, that happens all the time now. There are no inquiries. There are no apologies. There's been hospitals in Montreal. It'll happen twice within the course of a single weekend. So I bring that up several times in the book. Something that was just shocking and bone-chilling in 2008 is now becoming routine, and we don't even notice. Or there's any number of crimes in that category where just an offender who had multiple chances to be kept in jail was on early release, another early release, bail on top of the early release, and high risk to reoffend, and ends up victimizing someone, killing an innocent person. Just a completely egregious, preventable crime. Those are happening every couple of days now, and we mentioned Canadians sort of disconnect from this. Whenever I see a news story about one of those cases where just this was very easy to stop, we could have had interventions. We didn't even have to pass new laws to stop this person from getting out and murdering someone randomly on the street. And you'll see the comments below it, and they're saying, well, I hope justice is served in this case. I hope there is a strong, and I'm saying, well, what country do you live in? This is Canada. Justice is not going to be served. There is not going to be, the bar is closed and we don't have to worry about it again. It's going to be 4 or 5 years, and he's going to have parole hearings, and he's probably going to hurt someone else. Like, that is how the system is working. These are not errors of the system. I mean, when someone is a serial child molester and is out of jail within 4 years, that is the standard treatment for a serial child molester in Canada. So it is odd. People seem to just be watching too much American TV. They read the headline that says life sentence, not realizing that does not refer to a life sentence. That just means your parole never expires. And this comes up in a number of areas. It's weird how I do have faith in Canadians to do the right thing, but they often do not understand what is happening within their own country or what is happening to them as a result of policy.
You know, I mentioned to you a few minutes ago, I want to talk about anecdotes. You and I are both professional, trained journalists. And when I'm going to speak for myself here, but I suspect it's going to speak for you as well. When you encounter something horrific, your first instinct is not to assume it's widespread. Your first instinct is to assume it's an anomaly, especially if it's something you've experienced yourself. And then you kind of look into it. And I've had this exact same experience that you've had in recent years where you kind of go, wow, what a terrible one-off. And then you Google it. And then instead of finding the incident you're talking about, you get like 300 other hits of identical recent incidents. And you start to realize, yikes, okay, this is actually happening more than you think. And then maybe you go for say, crime. This is an example, or you're talking about deaths in waiting rooms. So you can go to StatCan crime statistics, or you go to the High Canadian Institute of Health information, and you start to actually build out a statistical case, and you start to see, well, this isn't rare at all. And then in some of these crimes, in fact, that they are increasing quite rapidly. I feel as though, to an extent, all of us are the proverbial frogs in the slowly heating pot. And we eventually might kind of look around and go, when did it get so bad? And when you start to look at the stats, everything you're talking about on metrics where Canada has become a notable outlier, they were fast, but they weren't sudden. And I know that kind of sounds like I'm making a weird distinction here. There was a process where we probably could have said, hey, why did this go up, 20% year over year? And we probably could have done something about it. But I think we as a country are just habituated to think this is Canada. Everything's fine here. If I'm hearing more instances of these things that we're talking about, it's probably just a fluke, or it's the media always wanting a bad news story. And then it maybe takes us 5 or 10 years to actually kind of look at the stats and go, oh, no, wait, we actually have a problem here. We have a large number of MAID. We have seen whole categories of crime increase quite a bit. We do have a housing affordability crisis, and so on and so on and so on.
There is a stat that I found in which I think is quite illuminating. I forget. I think it was Pew Research did studies of public trust. How much do people trust the government? And Canada had crazy high levels of public trust, even higher than like Switzerland, where essentially everybody's a cousin, and the government actually does work pretty well. So we're more inclined to be like, oh, the government knows what it's doing, and this is just from a couple of years ago. So my general thesis getting to the end of this is that Canada was a quite well-managed country for a lot of time. It wasn't too long ago. We were one of the richest countries on earth. We were spared many of the racial problems of the United States. So we were basically as rich as the United States, but spared all the problems of the United States. And you kept having international crises that just didn't hit Canada. I mean, the 2008 Great Recession being a great example. Canada came out of it better than usual. So I think we just got used to we'll stumble into a debt crisis, but Paul Martin will come and he'll fix it, magically, and it'll become the textbook case of how you fix a debt crisis. So I think we just got used to living in a country where we could assume that the government had our best interests at heart and would do what was best for us, and we were usually right a lot of the time. So crazy high levels of public trust to the point where now, something scandalous will happen, and the reaction is, this doesn't sound like Canada. It doesn't seem like something that would happen. I'm just going to ignore it. So, and another thing I highlight in the book is there will be instances in Canada that are identical to something that happened, say, in the UK. And when it happened in the UK, massive scandal, immediate policy changes,
public inquiry, resignations,
broad support. And then it happens in Canada and it's barely page 3. I mean, the example would be trans-identified males in women's prisons. When this happened, this basically led to the resignation of a Scottish First Minister. Huge headlines, inquiries, not a lot of massive controversy over the idea that you could go get convicted as a male, and then just self-ID as a woman and then be transferred to a women's prison, especially when you're a sex offender. You get jailed for raping women, and now you're in a prison full of women. So when this was happening at the time, I said, well, Scottish First Minister just resigned over this. It's actually more egregious in Canada because at least theirs was passed by legislation. We have the exact same policy, that all you need is, it's one of the simplest forms in the government of Canada, the form that you sign. I'm in prison. I'm a woman now, and now I need to go to a women's prison, because at least they had legislation. There was some transparency there. Ours was effectively an order in council. This was Justin Trudeau was at a 2017 town hall, and someone said, I don't think, a lot incarcerating someone in a place that doesn't match with their gender ID. I think that's torture. This was the word he used. And Trudeau said, yeah, I agree with you. Trans rights are human rights. And then, within a few hours, he was ordering the prison system to accommodate this. So if you look at the number of trans-identified males in women's prisons, it's higher in Canada than it ever was in parts of the UK, and has included, many sex offenders. And there are reports in the feminist press that this has resulted in harassment and sex assaults within women's prisons. Most Canadians don't know that. It certainly wasn't in any mainstream media. I think it mentioned a couple times in the National Post, but just that disparity between the UK, a country that is very similar to us in a lot of ways, and something like that happens, and we just don't notice, and can't even compute that it's happening here.
The question that I've been the most excited to ask you is one that stems out of my own experience writing about similar stories to what you're talking about here. I didn't do it in full book length form, but I write columns where I'll be like, here is a problem. And I will do all the homework I need to do to basically establish that this is not, I had a bad day and now I'm venting about it. But here is a problem. Here are the news articles that back this up. Here are quotes from subject matter experts. Here is statistics that shows the trajectory we're on or how we compare with international peers. And I get reactions that I can basically break down into three broad categories. And the first is, I would say, it's a good reaction, which is people go, hey, interesting. I didn't know that. And then there's the category I really like, which is, hey, Matt, this is great. I've had a similar experience. Thank you for shining a light on this. It makes me feel less crazy. Here's what my experience was. And then there's the third category. And this is the one I want to ask you about. I will get every time I write about anything that goes badly in Canada, anything that we could do better, a problem we could fix, a policy in need of review. I get some version of, if you hate it here so much, why don't you leave?
Yeah. Why don't you get out?
What was the reaction to you writing the book? Because basically, I get that reaction regularly. A couple of months ago, I basically wrote about about my hometown of Toronto. We've really been, it's almost like an in-joke here. And I know you visit Toronto occasionally. Our municipal trash service has not been doing a good job emptying the trash bins that are like public trash bins on street intersection corners, right? And it's sort of like a notorious joke.
Oh, yeah. The last time I was there, I noticed that. Most of Canada has this figured out.
Yeah. And, I had been south of the border for a family event, and I had noticed that the city I was in had an entire dedicated crew of guys whose job it was on a regular basis was to have a pickup truck pull up next to the municipal trash recycling bins, empty them, throw them into the back of the pickup truck, put in new bags, and leave. And they were just orbiting on a regular basis. And I basically wrote about, to exactly your point, this is a problem Toronto has that is not hard to solve. Other municipalities in Canada, in the United States, have solved this problem. And then when it was published, I remember thinking to myself, and now we wait and let's see how long it takes. And it was about an hour and a half before I got my first, if you love America so much, why don't you move there? And I guess the question is, you having taken that and blown it up into a full book form, what has the reaction been like? The book's been out for a little bit now. What have you been hearing from
maybe a few? There was a few radio interviews where they'd say, "Oh, listener came and said this is patriotic at a time when we're supposed to be, super." I mean, that person is almost always 55 plus because Canada is working quite well for them. Their real estate has gone up. They still have access to a family doctor. The auto theft hasn't reached their neighborhood yet. And they
It's
probably have good
coming.
insurance. So this is something I've discussed in other interviews, and we've seen it in demographic data. Is just there is still a cohort of people that the Canadian promise is working quite well. And if you try to tell them, okay, that's great for you, but it's really not working for these other sectors. When you're driving downtown in your Tesla and you notice that there's tent cities where there didn't used to be tent cities, try and imagine that there are many other aspects of societies that have declined to a similar extent. And, maybe Canada is different outside your living room and your memories. So I definitely have encountered it. I would say most of it's positive. I mean, the book is written. It's not. I didn't want it to be sort of a preachy conservative book. I wanted it to be aimed at this massive middle of Canadians who do not pay attention to politics. So I think you can take that person, the person who has to remind themselves what the political parties are each election. I think you can hand this book to them, and they're not going to say, "Oh, this is some right-wing screed." I think they're going to say, okay, this is approachable. This is readable. Because I live in Victoria, and I'm having people randomly approaching me and saying they read the book. This is NDP land. This is Victoria. So just random people I would not expect would be fans of this book saying this was, illuminating, and this taught me things I didn't know about the country. So yeah, that sentiment does exist. I think that is probably the most toxic sentiment that is causing all of this.
Yeah.
Because it's an enabling sentiment. It's saying it's because the root of this book, the sort of upside, the positive part of this book is all of our problems are caused by ourselves. So when you look at people say, you wrote this book about how much Canada sucks. Don't you hate Canada now? And I say, no. In terms of the problems Canada faces, so look at all of the other countries around the world and ask them, what's your biggest problem? It's usually massive, insoluble things you can't touch. So we've got desertification. What are we going to do about that? China's next door. It's going to invade us any minute. We have, it's Japan. We've got massive demographic collapse. So Canada really is insulated from these problems. Everything that is wrong with us is something that we did to ourselves. So you can get to the end of the book and conclude, these are not, or we don't need to live like this. I thought we did. I thought this was just the natural course of things, but we could be the richest country on earth with the best healthcare, with all of these things could be very much better. All we have to do is stop punching ourselves directly in the nuts or ovaries, what have you.
Or both.
That's its own challenge. But the fact that it's just like if you speak to someone who's gotten out of a sort of a dark, they've gotten over an alcohol problem, they've gotten over addiction, or whatever. Once you realize that these are your problems and you are the agent of your own of your life's own course, that can be sort of a liberating feeling because you realize, well, you can either continue to suck or it is within your power to fix it.
Yeah, it's funny. I have two more big questions for you and then a little one, and the little one's a fun one, so I wouldn't worry about it. And one of the big questions I was going to ask you is, how do we fix this? And my instinct is identical to yours here. I've written this in very similar ways, Tristin. You use different words, but like my sentiment is identical to you. Canada's actual most incredible blessing, it's Canada's advantage, so to speak, is that we have very few problems that are genuinely intractable. A lot like most other countries would kill to have problems that could be solved with legislative tweaks that would have broad public support.
Yeah.
And that's
like housing and affordability. It's like that's my favorite one. The fact that we can't afford houses, because you just look. Well, you guys got more trees than anyone else. You got more gypsum than anyone else. You've got more land than anyone else. This is a really dumb country to have an affordability crisis. And it's true. We have had housing crises before, and we just built our way out of them. Hopefully not with just modular homes stacked on top of each other. But this is something that materially we can fix in a way that other countries probably could not, like Malta.
Made crime, bail reform, drug policy. There would be fairly easy legislative, not perfect fixes. There's no silver bullets. There's no free lunch. But we could make all these problems better. And for the politicians, making the problems better would alienate a fairly small group of activists and zealots. But I think you said it before. Most of these issues are pretty 80-20. Maybe not that dramatic on some of them, but I don't know if there are any reasonable criminal justice reforms that you would want to pass that would have less than 50% public support. Almost any policy you would want to pass on this is going to be more popular than any of the parties that would be advocating for the policy. These are win-win-win politically, societally. You and I would feel better about ourselves. Like, it would be nothing but victory here. And yet it doesn't happen. I wanted to ask you, of the chapters you wrote, what do you think would be the one that would be the hardest to fix? Like, where would there actually maybe need to be a degree of political courage?
It probably, in terms of the one I did mention, housing unaffordability. So that would probably take the longest amount of time, just because we've dug such a huge hole.
Yeah.
So you could have immediate changes, but you do have to build to get us back to where 2004 was. You would have to build an absolute, lot of houses. I mean, you could do things like what they're sort of doing right now, moderately bring down immigration, and that'll, bring down rents in the short term. But in terms of the one that you couldn't feasibly fix within 3-4 years, that's the one. Because all of them, you could imagine that these could be turned around relatively quickly, if not instantaneously. So, like in the crime chapter, you mentioned there's a letter I quote signed by BC mayors, and these are some of the most left-wing politicians in elected office in Canada, and they're just saying,
urban politicians.
There's like 20 guys committing all the crimes. If you just kept those 20 guys in prison, like, our police could do other things instead of arresting these 20 guys over and over. Could you please do that, federal government? And no,
don't be silly. It's funny. I mean, here I am in the biggest city in the country, but I remember talking to he retired now, but at the time he was a very, very senior Toronto police officer. And it was an off the record conversation, so I won't name him, but we were at a social event. We're just schmoozing, right? And I had said to him, what is the one thing you wish the public knew about policing in the city that they don't? And maybe there's something we can do about that. And he thought about it for a minute, and he goes, petty crime is eternal, and there's not much we can do about that. He goes, purse snatchings and pickpockets and things like that. He goes, and there's like financial crimes, and there's honestly not a lot we can do about that except to try and have good enforcement and hopefully punish the guys who do it. And he goes, and then there's domestic crimes, and that's a social ill. And the police have a hard time. Like, we're always going to be responsive to that. There's not a lot we can do to stop that in advance. But he said to me, in terms of violent crime in the city, the stuff that really erodes public life and public safety and public confidence, he said to me, there's 3 million people in Toronto and there's almost 10 million people in the GTA. And probably 95% of the violent crime in the GTA is 500 people committing it. And he said, if we could arrest and sentence those guys, he goes, I'm not naive. I know they'd be replaced. Criminal organizations would remain. Incentives for criminal behavior would remain. But he goes, there are probably 500 people in the entire GTA who are responsible for 95% of the murders and 95% of the shootings. And he goes, and we know who they are, but we arrest them and they're back out in days in the case of bail, or even if there is a successful prosecution and they're sentenced, they're back out in 4 or 5 years. And he goes, that's not long enough for the ties for the criminal organizations to break down. So these guys basically go away, they cool off for a bit, they come out and they go right back into the gang, and it's all the same people. There hasn't been enough time. So the last big question I have for you, Tristin. I want to mention, actually, you're my hero this morning. You're recording this very early, your time for me. And there's an irony here because
not really that early.
Well, look, earlier than I like to get up. So God bless you. But you and I were planning on recording this last night. It would have been a much more reasonable hour for both of us. But I had to postpone because the power went off in my neighborhood and it stayed off for 7 hours. And I remember just kind of laughing about it. I'm like, well, my interview on Canadian capacity and decline has been delayed by a power outage. And I thought that was kind of a delightful irony there.
Yeah. There's probably a story in the Toronto Star this morning about actually power outages are good. They promote community. And compared to historic norms on a per capita basis, we're not actually having that many power outages. The question I wanted to ask you, and it's something that Jen and I have been talking a lot on our The Line podcast, which is the one where she and I gab at each other.
How much of this problem could just be laid at the foot of liberals? And I don't mean political liberals. I mean small L, moderate, centrist liberals, whatever you call them. How many of our problems could we solve if these people rediscovered their ability to just say no to bad ideas? Yes, we want to help.
You want me to just start tranching out people to blame? That's my second book.
Yeah, you know what? I mean, if you want to give us like a preview chapter of it now, I'll take it.
I thought we could break it down just, by first names who sort of crop up in a lot of these things.
I think I know the ones you would be meaning. One of the things, and you and I, for instance, we've talked a little bit about self-ID for male prisoners in the correctional system. I think 80 to 90% of Canadians probably think that's a bad idea. But 10% of Canadians, if we bring it up, and we'll probably see some of this in the comments eventually, will be like, well, Matt and Tristin just want trans kids to kill themselves. And I don't know why we allowed extremists to gain a monopoly. And the only thing that would have been required to stop that from happening would have been for the enormous blob of well-meaning people in the center to say no to bad ideas. But it we just stopped doing that.
I mean, there are. This book describes in the gender ID chapter. I spoke to Coach Linda Blade, and she describes actually one of these meetings where she's sitting in a meeting, and they're like, "Okay, we're just going to do self ID in sports," and she's like, "Well, that makes no sense. An 18-year-old boy can slaughter." The Olympic a female Olympic champion. The body types are so different. This is going to destroy every women's record. This is way at the beginning, before this was a controversy, and she describes it. They just kind of look at their hands in this meeting. So, I mean, yes, these bad ideas were presented to rooms full of people. They're not all insane. They knew they were bad ideas, but they just like, okay, maybe we can just sort of, have an anti-racism session. And this will just sort of go away, and we don't have to think about it. So, in terms of how you fix that and say no to things, the worst case scenario, the guaranteed scenario, is that everything just gets so bad. We've seen any number of these figures, some of them whom are quoted in the book, who are just sort of your standard Canadian. I vote for the NDP each election, and everything's fine until the system comes for them, and it changes their way of viewing very quickly. Amy Ham being a great example, where it just puts up a J.K. Rowling billboard and enters this just odyssey of an institution who has decided you have wrong think. And a lot of those people have cropped up because they all get in touch with me, where they're like, I thought I could trust the system, or I encountered the full brunt of the criminal justice system. I remember my family was victimized.
Yeah.
I actually required medical care, and I saw how difficult that is to obtain. I said something moderately uncontroversial at work, and now the hammer is being brought down on me, and I'm afraid to say anything. Every day there are more of those Canadians. Obviously the last election just voted in the status quo once again, but you saw massive demographic shifts. So it's basically old people voted for the Liberals. But I got to say, we're probably the only country in the world. I have not found another place within the last 50 years in which you can say this, in which your average 21-year-old Canadian is more likely to support a Conservative Party than your average 70-year-old Canadian. There are countries in which there have been elections in which there's been a majority of youth voting for a Conservative candidate, Brian Mulroney, Margaret Thatcher, Ronald Reagan. But to do that more so than the older cohort, I don't think that's ever happened. I can't think of, maybe there's some South American country where that occurred. But that would indicate to me, when you look at sort of these polls, or when you look at electoral intentions, the people who are exposed to reality more so are sort of waking up to this, and are realizing changes need to be made. But it's Canada. We're one of the richest countries on earth. We have a lot of people who are insulated from reality and never have to face it.
Yeah, this is I told you I had one more small question for you, so I won't extend the podcast down a whole other trench here. But I'm not sure what your family is like. I know you have young kids. But do you have younger cousins, or do you have anyone in your life who's about 10, 20 years younger than you that you actually talk to on a regular basis?
There's a 15-year-old niece.
Sure, that counts.
Someone in their 20s. I live next to a high school.
My wife has younger cousins. just on her family, the age band is wider than my family. They're great kids, but they're different than I was. And I just don't mean this like with their long hair and their music. Like, I don't mean like I hate their pop culture. Their political and social priorities are different. And that is a rational response to the country they grew up in, which is not the country I grew up in. And it's not the country that you grew up in. You know, I mentioned to you a little bit earlier in the podcast, like
riding public transit is terrifying. It was super fun when we were kids.
Yeah. That's a great example. I mentioned bollards in my neighborhood, secure gates.
I live next to a high school. When I'm cleaning out the bushes behind my house, the only beer cans I can find are beer cans that I threw there, you know, in the 1990s. I mean, the kids that I see at this particular school, and no loud music. I mean, I went to the lake with my spouse just a few months ago. Well, I guess it wouldn't have been last summer. Mm-hmm. And I found all the kids there, conservatively dressed, keeping their music low. What they're listening to is very inoffensive. It's just sort of like vaporwave, just sort of like elevator music. Nobody's doing drugs. Nobody's drunk. Nobody's yelling. These are some of the most well-behaved kids. It's like going back to the 50s movie. And so even just culturally, there's some weirdos, but I would say I'm surprised at how normal the kids are these days. And I do think that's a reaction to a Canada that's kind of nuts.
Well, and the stats do back that up, right? Like, look at social indicators for Canada, the United States, most Western countries, age of first relationship, age of first sexual contact.
You know, I'm seeing like, there are only two genders. God save the king. You know, if you want to be rebellious in Victoria, that's what it looks like.
Free trade is good, yeah. Just sprawled on the side of an underpass. Tristin, one last question for you, buddy, and great to talk with you again. Grateful for your time. The book is "Don't Be Canada: How One Country Did Everything Wrong All at Once." Where should people pick up a copy?
On the internet, you can purchase an ebook from Amazon directly from Sutherland House Books, and there's an audiobook coming out post haste. So if you hate reading, I can read it to you.
You know what? I was going to ask for a personal rendition anyway, so the audiobook will probably save us both a little time and logistics. Tristin, great to talk with you, buddy. Keep up the great work, and all the best to you, all the best to the kids, and say hi to all the lefties in Victoria.
Will do.
That was my conversation with National Post reporter and columnist, and many moons ago, my former intern, Tristin Hopper. Today, just a friend and colleague, but also now, for your purposes, the author of Don't Be Canada: How One Country Did Everything Wrong All at Once. Check that out. As I asked Tristin if there's a particular place he wanted you to buy it. Was there a landing code or something that would help him out? He said, no, buy it wherever you want to buy it. So please buy Tristin's book. I read it over one of the recent long weekends. It was funny. And I've been telling people, well, it was sad, but it was also funny because Tristin's funny. And I've been telling people to go pick up a copy. This book has my endorsement. Coming up in the next segment is something I need to explain to you guys just a little bit. We are an advertising partner with the Métis Nation of Ontario. They pay for ads that we air on our podcasts, including this episode of On the Line. I am going to be interviewing in a moment someone who is involved in the Métis Nation of Ontario. I want to explain to you, and I want to just be as transparent as possible, this is actually a coincidence. I needed to talk to someone who could speak with authority to some of the controversy right now over resource development projects in Canada, including the federal government and the Ontario government. And I was looking around for a subject matter expert who could talk to me about this. And someone who was recommended to me, particularly in the Ontario context, is a man by the name of Mitch Case. He is a regional councillor and provincial secretary with the Métis Nation of Ontario. He's also a trained historian. He knows what he's talking about on these issues, but I want to make clear to you that this was not sponsored content. What do I mean by that? They did not pay for this interview. They did not control the questions. They did not see them in advance. Everything you're going to hear is a normal interview, and this is a disclosure. They are an advertising partner of ours, but what you will hear next is just a conversation between me and him where there was no prior planning or coordination, but I would encourage you to stick around. I thought it was going to be about a 15-minute talk about resource developments, and we do talk about that, but then Mitch had an interesting comment about heritage, history, how Canadians understand Canada and themselves. And that took us in a new conversation. So please enjoy my conversation with Mitch Case from the Métis Nation of Ontario. Now, Mitch, I've got a lot of questions for you, including a surprise question I've been told to ask you, but for fun, we're going to save that to the end. Don't worry, it's nothing controversial. I just want to reiterate what I was just telling the viewers and the listeners a minute ago. You've been a partner of the line for months now, and we're glad to have you. But it was me coming to you on this one about a month ago. I asked a friend of ours, a mutual friend, and I'm like, I need to find someone who can speak about Indigenous issues, particularly in Ontario. And she looked at me like I was an idiot and goes, "You're already partnered with the Métis Nation. Like, what are you talking about? Just call them." And I went, "Oh, right. Okay." But what I wanted to talk about is we've got a new federal government. And I think, that government was only elected about 7 weeks ago, but I think the polls in advance gave us about 2.5 months of notice that was going to be the case. We also have a recently reelected provincial government in Ontario. Both these guys, Prime Minister Carney and Premier Ford, are grabbing onto resource development, and they've got legislative tools they want to use. They have executive powers they want to use. But the one thing that almost every expert is recognizing is going to be, I don't want to call it a problem, but it's going to be an issue, something that has to be negotiated literally, is consultation. And that is largely with Indigenous peoples. I want to ask you a very basic question, and we'll get into some more of the details. From your perspective and from the perspective of the Métis Nation of Ontario, what constitutes consultation? Like, what do you want to see from either the province or the feds before a big resource project gets approved?
For sure. So I think it's actually really important, Matt, that we frame some of the discussion in, the way that the Supreme Court has laid out that test, right? It's actually the duty to consult and accommodate. It's actually, it's a positive obligation to accommodate. And, one of the things that we struggle with, and that I think Indigenous peoples across Canada struggle with, is the, cumulative effect of resource development in our communities and in our territories that, continues to impact the way of life, right? And so, my community, let's use a historic example in my community, right? You've got the development of St. Mary's paper and Algoma steel, 130 years ago, right? The development of the power dams, all of those things. Not one of those things led to the collapse of the whitefish fishery at the rapids in Sault Ste. Marie, but all five of those things together, the fishery is gone, right? And now today, just as the fish stocks are rebuilding up, the fish stocks now have unacceptable levels of mercury and other things in them that make it, oh, good, there's fish there again. But if you eat it, you'll die, right? Well, that's not, that doesn't lead to the continuation and the survival of our way of life and our, so what we're looking at, and I say, broadly, Indigenous peoples are looking at, how do we mitigate those impacts, right? That, to a shareholder or a board member or whoever, at some company in Toronto, that it just doesn't occur to them that's an issue, right? For us, I think broadly, a lot of Canadians don't understand that Indigenous peoples, we still are connected to our traditional territories. We still feed our families from those traditional lands, right? And, if your food and your water are impacted, we don't just go to Farm Boy or Joe Fresh, or no, Joe Fresh is a clothing store, Freshie or Freshco or wherever that is, and go pick up some uncontaminated moose meat, right? That's not how that works, right? And so when we look at those those duty to consult and accommodate, that's about actually, let's prevent as much possible damage as possible, right? And so, I think that's the perspective that we approach things from. So.
Yeah, and it's interesting because I say this as a guy, Mitch, I've been in the media for almost 20 years, and I've been a writer and I've been an editor. So I've worn both hats. And one of the things I used to say to writers when I was an editor was, there's a missing piece in your article. And it wasn't always about Indigenous issues, but I could say, come on, there's a really obvious problem here that you're just ignoring. You're hand waving it away. You've got to fix that. And then what I began as an editor, I began to notice is what I called the hand wave paragraph, which reads something like, in your case, it would be, of course, the concerns of Indigenous peoples must be considered. And then boom, you're just right back to the main argument. And over the last couple of weeks, when I've been reading about the federal legislation to ram through new resource projects, and I've also been looking at Bill 5 as proposed in Ontario, basically the same thing. I think I support, in theory, what these projects want to do. Like, I want to live in a country where regulatory approvals are fast and efficient, but I don't know how anyone's going to hand wave the Supreme Court obligations away. What is this again? This is again a very basic question before we talk a little bit more detail here. What is your experience or the experience of the people you work with been? How do the negotiations work? Like, do they show up and go, well, we want to do a thing, and the bad news is it will destroy your entire traditional home, so let's bargain down from that position? How does it actually work? Like, what are the tangible things that are offered as accommodation, as you called it?
Yeah. So, there's probably better people to talk to about this, particularly just because, of the community I represent. There is less of this type of industrial development around our community than in other places. But as your question there, Matt, about do they show up and say, listen, this is what the impact is going to have? No, they actually don't. They show up and say, this won't affect anything. This is going to be, we're going to build this, X, Y, Z. We're going to build this transmission line, this pipeline, this whatever. And, it is going to be rainbows and puppies and unicorns, and it's going to be great and wonderful and awesome. And we have to work backwards from, we know that's not true. We know that like here are the study after study after study. Here is the, the impact of, this chemical, this, all of these other sorts of things, right? Here is the impact of, just opening up more roads means, this much more use of, pesticide spray chemicals in the ditches, right? Like just those little things that, people don't think about, but we see and we feel that impact, right? And so, we actually have to, many times you're working backwards from, the proponent is saying, no, this is all going to be wonderful. There will be, it'll mean jobs, it'll mean whatever. Yeah, that's great. Okay, I understand it'll mean jobs. I understand it'll mean economic development. But you're not looking at it from our perspective, right? And you're not, and for us, it's so hard to get to, we're negotiating on some sort of respectful basis when it doesn't start with, as your question was, hey, this is really going to screw things up. How do we mitigate it? It's no, it'll have no impact, when we know that's not true. And so it starts out from this almost this distrustful place, right? Because we're not being honest with each other, right? So it really is a challenge.
Mitch, I want you to know I would never make a joke about what your people are going through on this front. But like when you're talking there, it occurs to me, I live in a neighborhood in Toronto where people would take to the streets if someone proposed like a 4-story apartment building.
Yeah.
And they would probably be able to get the project shut down. Less and less so recently, but like, I cannot tell you how many petitions have been stuck in my mailbox to talk about like neighborhood character. Oh, this building will be too tall. It will be out of, here. And then meanwhile, up in north, particularly in northern areas, not always northern areas, but areas of the country that are generally speaking lightly populated and resource rich, we're talking about getting access to these resources. And Mitch, I like to think I'm a pragmatist on this. Like my life is better because of technology and resources and all those things. But we've all heard the horror stories. You talk about the mercury in the fish. That's like, that was one of the examples that came just easily came to mind. What is there a model that anyone is using? And as you had said, not your home area is not where a lot of these industrial projects are being proposed. But what I always ask whenever we run into a difficult situation like this, where everybody's got their interests and everybody's got their concerns, who's doing it well? Like, is there someone out there who we can just look to and go, let's just steal from those people and go, we're going to do what they're doing and we're not going to try and reinvent the wheel?
Yeah. I wish I had a good, clear, here's the model. One of the things that we are facing in our community. So for, well over a century, Algoma Steel has been, producing steel there, which is a huge part of our local economy. Hey, a lot of my citizens, Métis citizens, a lot of them work there, right? Like that's not we understand, like we're not, we're not unaffected by these things, and we're all in one way or another complicit in, the economic or the environmental issues that we are facing as a species, right? Humanity, there's more and less guilty, but there's, no one can say they don't know what's going on, right? And but what we're seeing now, for a long time, you can go and look at studies that show Sault Ste. Marie is having one of the highest cancer rates in Ontario, largely because of the placement of the steel plant, and it's down, like literally, it's at the west end of the Soo, and all of its emissions get blown over the city, and we have some of the highest rates of, certain types of cancer. They're shutting down those the coke ovens, and they're opening electric arc furnaces. That's fantastic. We're very, very happy to hear that. And at the same time, they're proposing to develop the ferrochrome smelter for the Ring of Fire on the same site. And so, from our perspective, oh, good, we can trade one kind of cancer for another. Excellent. That is excellent, right? That's really the position we want to be in, And so, and it's sort of from that perspective of, look at how great it's going to be. You're not going to have to breathe that stuff anymore. No, we can just drink it in, right? It's not, that is not, free, prior, and informed consent. And at the same time, then the proponent tells us we don't actually have to consult with you because it's inside the municipality. And so anything that happens within the borders of a municipality, we don't have to do duty to consult with Indigenous peoples. So, it's just absolutely, those are the kind of ridiculous things that we run into that, quite frankly, drive up the cost of the process, drive up the cost of, rather than let's be honest and come to the table. So, I don't want to start, I don't want to say where there's, I think, a model that's working or whatever, because I think the best answer to that, I think, Matt, is sit down and listen to the communities and work with the community and say, what process would work for you, right? What process, what do you need to see? Because, the needs of my, the Métis community in Sault Ste. Marie that I represent versus even the First Nations who are our neighbors, in our territory there, our neighbors, they would have a different process. So that needs to be the approach, right? And, I think, Canada, expects other countries to follow our laws, when dealing with us. Well, then let's do the same thing here, right?
I want to, you talked about the proponent, the person who's proposing the project. When you're negotiating, who are you negotiating with? Is it with the companies? Is it with the feds on behalf of the companies? How does that actually work? Like when you actually get a boardroom somewhere, who's in it?
Yeah, so I think Canadians, largely don't understand this. The way that it's set up, the Supreme Court has established that it is the Crown that has a positive obligation to, consult and accommodate. The Crown then, the Crown, either in right of Canada or the provinces, whoever it is, the Crown then delegates that authority. They're delegating, what is their authority and their responsibility to, whoever the proponent is. So whatever business it is that's trying to push the project through. So they delegate that authority to them. And then once they say, they've reached some sort of an agreement or whatever else with the community, then that's when the Crown says, okay, then we'll give a permit, right? We'll give a approval to the project. But if they fail to meet that process, then the responsibility goes back to the Crown, right? And so, it's one of these problems that largely, it's one of the problems that I have largely with our, our Western economic system is, in many ways, these, the corporations have privatized the gains and they have socialized the losses, right? That they, the environmental impact, it is all of our responsibility to fix, but the profit is just their shareholders. Right? And it is a challenge that, where there is, downstream impact or cumulative effect or whatever else, it's only the Crown that we can turn to for justice as Indigenous people, right? So, by the Crown delegating that authority away, it's only creating a bigger problem for itself in the end, right? And so, I think there's a bit of a wholesale rethink we need to have.
This is going to be a big question, and it's not going to be an easy one for you to answer. I'm not asking this to sandbag you. I'm just going to even put a general box around this here. One of the things we often hear about in the national press or local press, not specifically Indigenous press, kind of broad market press, is that there are different perspectives within the Indigenous community. And to which my response has always been, well, yeah, human beings have different opinions on stuff. No kidding. But one of the questions has been that there are within Indigenous communities in Canada, there are voices that are more pro-development and there are voices that are less pro-development. And guys like me should not be the ones trying to determine who is the real voice here. I'm just curious in general, to the extent the Métis Nation of Ontario has a position on this, where do you guys stand on development? And I know it's a huge question we could probably spend an hour on it, but you mentioned citizens of yours working at the steel mills here. I have to imagine we talk about jobs. We just don't mean jobs for other people. It would include jobs within your own community. Where does the feeling even on this one land?
Yeah, I mean, I think in many ways, when you look at the history of Métis people, we are an inherently pragmatic and practical people, right?
Yeah, I would even say entrepreneurial.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely entrepreneurial people, and we're, but we also have to, one of the things that I hear, some of the elders that I work with talk about is that we actually have to, we should be by now able to learn from our mistakes, right? And when you look at, as the fur trade, over trapped, as it moved westward, it trapped out entire species, right? Trapped out entire populations of fur-bearing animals that then led to its own economic collapse, right? You watch how the fur trade collapsed, as a viable economy, not because those hats went out of style, but because well, I don't know. There's nothing left to trap. What are you going to do? And we should learn from that, right? We should learn from that mistake, and I think we have to be practical and pragmatic as a species right now. Like, I don't think it's alarmist to say that we are in the next 10, 20 years going to decide. And there are some scientists who would say that we've already decided and we chose the wrong thing about 20 years ago, I don't think it's alarmist. I don't think it's out to lunch to say, we are making decisions right now that will determine whether or not we have a future at all. And so, I think we have an obligation to figure out, what do we have to do to, slow down, mitigate, and then eventually reverse what we as a species have done to this planet. And because it's not going to just hurt the planet. It is, I grew up, I'm a George Carlin fan from way back, and I won't repeat it explicitly, but he essentially said, the people, the planet is fine, the people are the ones that are in trouble, right? It'll be us that are in trouble, right? Well, and so we have to find a way forward.
My favorite Carlinism, and I think it also applies to this situation, is never forget that 50% of people are dumber than the average man.
Yeah. So think about how dumb the average person is. I didn't realize half of them are dumber than that.
So I think that's germane to what we're talking about here. I got one more question on the resource stuff, and then I want to ask you a broader question. With Carney coming in and kind of having this limited window of opportunity to kind of get some quick wins, right? Every politician wants to set a tone, set the agenda. Doug Ford having been reelected, are there some projects where you think, and I'm not asking you to sign the lands away or anything here, but are there some projects you think make sense? Like, what would be some things you could go to them and be like, here are some things we can work with you guys on? Like, are there things that they've been ignoring or they haven't been paying attention to, where you think it might be possible to have a quick win? Or do you think a lot of the processes will be, I don't want to say adversarial, but will have to be some haggling?
Yeah, I mean, I can't speak to specific projects that, but I think, the best advice I can give really is, let's find ways to, figure out what our mutual goals are, right? Mm-hmm. And we as Indigenous people, we have a whole hell of a lot of problems, and we have a whole list of very legitimate reasons why we are, frustrated, disappointed, pissed off, whatever term you want to use to talk about Canada, Ontario, and all the other provinces. We have a whole lot of very legitimate reasons, and we have a lot of things we still need to get right. None of those get easier though if our economy collapses because of this 51st state nonsense, and nothing gets easier if Canada's quote unquote sovereignty, which is the way that their sovereignty interacts with Indigenous sovereignty, is still an outstanding question. But it doesn't get easier if the Russians or the Chinese set up resource extraction in the north, and we can't do anything about it. And so if Canada is not honoring its treaties, I don't think foreign governments are going to honor Canada's treaties with us, right? And so I think we all, this is a moment for us all to realize, not what's important and what's not, but what's most important right now, and what are the other important things that we'll come back to, right? And Canada just needs to realize that we're coming back to those other discussions.
So you were saying a minute ago about learning from history. And this is actually where I wanted to ask you something. And, look, you guys, and I've been upfront with the listeners' viewers about this. You guys are an advertising partner with the line. This episode is not SpawnCon. You did not buy this time, but you guys have been a partner with us. And one of the things that your advertising campaign, when you've been focusing on with us, has been focused on your heritage. And I'm gonna make a confession to you. You're probably gonna roll your eyes at me. When I was approached originally by a woman who works with you, is a friend of mine and works with you guys, and she said, "Hey, one of my clients, she's in the communications field, is the Métis Nation of Ontario," and I went, "What are you talking about? The Métis are in Manitoba," and that was my immediate response was, "What are you talking about?" Like, I am a reasonably well-educated Canadian on history, and most of my focus was on sort of world affairs, 20th century. But you don't get a pair of history degrees like I have without taking a bunch of Canadian survey courses. Everything I had learned, and that includes Indigenous history, like early European contact, Western expansion, the treaty systems, dealing with the Americans, the War of 1812, blah, blah, blah. I absolutely knew what the Métis were, or I thought I did. And I thought the Métis were the French-speaking people who lived in Manitoba. And then she provided me a bunch of documents, including the Supreme Court reference that you've already mentioned here. I want to ask you a very basic question. Why is a guy like me, who is actually fairly reasonably well-educated on these matters, why didn't I know that the Métis Nation of Ontario was a thing?
Oh, I mean, I think, I go back to my friend, the late Senator Murray Sinclair, right? When he talked about, while Indigenous peoples were in residential schools learning all sorts of horrible things about themselves and having cultures destroyed and, all those things, Canadians were in mainstream schools not hearing anything about Indigenous people, right?
Yeah.
The way that Senator Sinclair used to talk about that, right? They were, if you heard anything about Indigenous people, you heard that they used to be here, but they're gone now.
Yeah.
That largely is the experience. Now, there has been a big shift in that in the last 10, 15, 20 years that, there has been significant progress, and there are a whole lot of things left to do. But I think it's easier to get things done if you're building on progress, and there has been a lot of progress on the education front. So I'm not suggesting you go back to school, but if you went, you might learn different things than when you were there or when I was there, right? But the challenge that we have in understanding who the Métis people are is it really has become the Red River thing, right? And when you look only at if there's also, what I think most Canadians understand about Canadian history is 1867, Vimy Ridge, and then, I don't know, Pierre Trudeau did something. There's a document, some sort of important document, and then, I don't know, 1995, Quebec had another referendum that was this close. That's really what I think most Canadians know about their own history, right? Which is, for me as a historian, it breaks my heart that people don't know more. But so if that's what people know about their own history, then it's not unreasonable to think that they know even less about someone else's, right? And so, for us, that is one of the biggest challenges we have is that people largely don't know who we are, or they think they know, and sometimes that's even worse.
Yeah, no,
people think they know things, but
No, and you know what? I think that's fair. I remember about 30 years ago. So you said there's been a lot of change over the last 15, 20 years. So I'm going back 30 years. I would have been in like late elementary school when you start learning history. And I loved history. Mitch, you mentioned being a trained historian. So am I. That was before I made the life-altering decision to pursue a career in the media. I thought I'd be a historian. And what we learned about Indigenous peoples was basically the long huts. There were Algonquin and Huron, and then there were the Cree, and they were somewhere. And then they sort of never finished the chapter. They just kind of moved on to something else. And then in other parts of the textbooks, there would be like, and there was a terrific Indian soldier in the First World War. And then I would be reading this. I'm like, is this like India or is this like North American India? Like, and it wasn't always even clear. And then I'm not even going to say it was in high school, but more in university, I think we were starting to see the signs of that change that you were talking about here, where there would be very basic bachelor level survey courses on First Nations history in Canada. And then you'd go in and again, you'd think you're going to hear of like the Algonquin Roundtable or something. And then to be like the Wendat, who are they? Like none of the kids coming into it had ever heard of this before. And I, to your point, like, yeah, I agree with you. There's been progress and I like progress, but I was a little bit annoyed with myself being a guy who is trained in this, is for my own, like to the extent I have free time. I like to read Canadian history. I didn't know nearly as much as I should have about this. So you say that there's been progress here. I want to ask you this question. It's a little bit of a mix of the heritage and the politics question. Is it translating? Is the progress in knowledge, is it helping you guys actually get what you need?
Yeah, I mean, in some ways it is, in some ways it's not. I think, I forget who said it, the truth will set you free, but first it's going to piss you off, right? And in some ways, I don't know. It's a bit of a challenge, right? Because I think in some ways we were making a lot of progress on Canadians, like I say, Indigenous people. We've known the truth the whole time, and it's come with being really pissed off about it, right? And then Canadians were, like I said earlier, they were in some ways, hidden away or sheltered from understanding, the true history of Canada. And I think just as we were starting to make some real progress in this country about unpacking some of that history, that's when COVID showed up, right? Like right when we were getting beyond just the, kumbaya moments of, truth and reconciliation and, every hockey team doing their, Indigenous night, whatever that means, and these, somewhat meaningless land acknowledgements from time to time, like just as we were starting to unpack and there was going to be a real serious conversation, that was being led, by Indigenous people in North Dakota at Standing Rock and by the Wet'suwet'en people in British Columbia, and a real serious conversation, COVID happened. And then Canadians' attention went from, what do we do to repair this relationship to I can't pay my mortgage and I don't care anymore. I'm over it. I don't care. Right. And so, I don't begrudge, the average Canadian for their sometimes lack of focus on these issues. If you got kids who need to be fed and you've got to keep a roof over their head and you got to get them to, hockey practice. I get why, whatever. What I do really resent and what I think Indigenous peoples really resent is when governments then choose the fact that Canadians are, have other priorities to say, oh, well, we're going to not do anything right now. We're going to back off. Justice delayed is justice denied. And for our peoples across Canada, like, this is not just it's politically expedient right now. We have our own, priorities that need to be, able to continue to move forward, whether they're politically popular or not. Right.
Something I've observed myself, Mitch, and this might be one of those truths that pisses you off, but I don't think you're going to disagree with it. Something you and I have in common is that we know a little bit of history, at least. And I've already told you there's parts of history I wish I knew more of, but I have a framework that I can put this stuff into. And when I discover something new, I go, oh, okay, well, this fits in here. And maybe it changes how I feel about something or how I understand something, but I know where to put it. I think a lot of Canadians don't have that framework in a very basic way, understanding their country, understanding their culture. They don't have a scaffold to attach this new information from. And look, I got Facebook, I got Instagram. I'm in touch with people I've known all my life. Maybe we don't talk to each other much anymore, but I'm in touch with them. And a lot of the same people who a couple of years ago were putting up orange banners for the kids are now putting up elbows up stickers. And it's sort of like, we've got to go from we're stacking shoes and teddy bears at the local steps of the elementary school to drill, baby, drill. And you can see this by just scrolling through their Facebook photos. And these are good people. They mean well. But I don't know how to explain to them that these memes might be in conflict.
Yeah, I don't know how to explain it either, and I think, the other thing, I've always heard the expression, diplomacy needs as many words as it can get its hands on, right? And I think, we have to just be able to continue the conversations, right? Continue that unpacking our history together. One of the things that I think Canada does such a terrible job at is telling its own history. Americans, let me tell you this, Americans don't know anything about their history. Nothing at all. They don't have a clue about their history, but they think they do. I don't even think Canadians think they understand their history, right? Americans think they do, because if I don't spend any time over there now, but in days past, I live in a border town, right? We used to go over just for, there was a really good Thai restaurant in Sioux, Michigan. We'd go over just for lunch, right? Like check the app, see if the bridge is, there's no lineup, let's go, right?
Go get lunch. Yeah.
But you go over there, and like every little town in Michigan, every little town across the United States has a reasonably funded little local museum that tells you the history of, some pioneer came here and, he, stuck a shovel in the ground, and now we call it, this town's named after him, right? Like Canadians, I don't think most Canadians understand anything about their own history, because there is really no investment in telling that. And if you don't have, like you say, if you don't have that framework, right? Like, I think what the Americans struggle with is, challenging the just pure propaganda that their government invested in for the better part of a century, but, and then as soon as you challenge that framework, people don't know what to do with it. I think Canadians just have no real framework at all to hang their understandings on. And I think that really is a challenge, right? And if we don't learn from our history, I really don't know where we're going. So,
well, I have a hunch where we're going, but we won't bog down the podcast by getting into that.
It's not good.
Yeah. So I had one more question for you, and this is the curveball. Our mutual friend who had suggested that I interview, when I had told her that I wanted to talk with someone who, because I know that some of the files she works on in her comms firm involve Indigenous communities and resource companies. So I basically said to her, I got to talk to someone who can speak to this. And she said, talk to Mitch, you idiot. So one of the things she told me today, just as a bit of a curveball, is she said, ask him about the vest. I don't know what that means, but you're wearing a vest right now. It has beadwork on it. So tell me about the vest.
Yeah, well, okay. Yeah, I didn't. Yeah, that is curveball. Because you don't know why you're asking it.
Hey, I'm just wearing a golf shirt, right? So you got something going on that I don't.
So this, I've been a beadworker for many years. I learned that from folks in my community and others across the Métis Nation. And so this is the vest that I made when we went to have our meeting with Pope Francis. And so I was for many years outside of my work with the Métis Nation, I worked in various capacities, from student, volunteer to like staff member, whatever, at both Algoma University and Chingwak-Kinumag-Egimik, which is First Nations post-secondary education institute in Sault Ste. Marie. And it's actually located on the site. Matt, if you're ever in Sault Ste. Marie, you gotta go and check out, and your listeners, go to the Algoma University campus and go and check out the work that has been done. The main building of Algoma University used to be the Chingwak Residential School, right? And so it closed in 1970, 71, and the university opened up in like 72, 73. And So the survivors from that school, though, have worked to reclaim that building, and it's a function. There's offices and classrooms and whatever, but the hallways are like a living museum to the history of that residential school and the resilience of those survivors. And so I've done a lot of work with Métis residential school survivors across, from Ontario West, and when we had the opportunity to go and be a witness, you have to really understand the Métis experience was very largely overlooked in the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. The Métis specific schools, particularly the Isle Across School in Saskatchewan, was left out of the settlement agreement. Those survivors have still not been compensated. They have still not been apologized to. And the only difference being that they're Métis and that the province helped pay for the school. And so for me, the ability to go with those three wonderful, beautiful, Angie, Anne, and Emile, these three absolutely beautiful, courageous people who went through untold horrors as tiny little children. And I don't have kids of my own, but I've got 13 nieces and nephews, and, right from like 6 weeks old to 20 something, I've seen them all grow up, and I cannot imagine what those children went through. And for the Métis survivors in particular, to have seen everyone else be apologized to and not them, this was wrong when it happened to someone else, but it wasn't wrong when it happened to you, is a particularly new form of trauma that is cruelly being re-inflicted on them over and over and over again. And so this is the vest I made that I wore when I was over there, getting to witness, everybody when we came, oh, it must have been an honor to meet the Pope. And I've said that over and over 1,000 times. Yeah, I think it was an honor for him to meet us. I think it was an honor for him to hear from us, right? Because, the challenge of reconciliation is confronting our shared history, right? The good, the bad, and the ugly, right? And I think, this is, every time I put this vest on, I think of, sitting there in that room while those three survivors sat 3 feet away from the Holy Father and said, this is what they did to me. This is what happened to me, right? And it wasn't okay, and for me, that will forever be, and again, it has absolutely nothing to do with, and I don't mean it any sort of dismissively or disrespectfully to the Holy Father, but it was one of the most important moments of my entire life, hearing those survivors get to finally speak their truth that no one has listened to, no one has cared about, but for them to be able to say, this is what happened and it wasn't okay. That's one of those things that I'll never ever forget.
A last question for you, Mitch. I'll let you go. When the late Pope Francis heard these stories, how did he respond?
The institution of the church has continued to fail in their response to these things. They seem to never miss an opportunity to miss an opportunity. And I've told them a few times, I said to one of the bishops, I said, you gotta get rid of your comms people, because the problem you have is that your comms people are true, like they're true believers in the Catholic Church, which means they defer to you. They don't tell you what you need to know. They defer to you. And so rather than, give you straight up good advice, like I was like, you should hire a Protestant or something, like somebody who doesn't believe in you, because right now they're just telling you what you want to hear. And so the institution has a whole hell of a long way to go before it really can make those things right. But let me tell you, I truly believe, from his public actions, but also from those private moments that we had with Pope Francis, I think he was as honest and genuine as you could be, right? I think he was actually listening. He was really paying attention. And you can tell when someone is just uncomfortable with what they're hearing because it's uncomfortable to hear.
Yeah.
And when it's uncomfortable because there's a difference between, I don't want to hear this and I'm so sorry to hear this. Right. There is a difference in that. And I think Pope Francis was really, I think he was really honest and genuine. Yeah.
Mitch, we've covered a lot of ground here, and yet we've still only barely scratched the surface. Really appreciate your time. It is a beautiful vest. I didn't know it was loaded with such emotional resonance, but it looks good on you. So you've got that going for you as well.
Thank you. Yeah, I just want to just say, Matt, like, when we talk about that understanding and, my home community in Sault Ste. Marie, if you or your listeners or anyone, are in and around Sault Ste. Marie, do you live there or, just visiting, we're doing a lot of work there in the community to tell that we've just opened the first Métis Heritage Center in Ontario. We've got our Canoes for Conservation project with the Lake Superior Watershed Conservancy, that you get out in that canoe and see Sault Ste. Marie from our perspective, understand it from our history. All of those sorts of things that we're really doing our part to help Canadians understand. And so we certainly invite Canadians and Ontarians to come and work with us and learn with us together.
Well, I'm terrible in a canoe, so maybe I'll stick to some sort of raft, but no, it's a good offer. Mitch, really appreciate your time. Thanks so much for this. And look, we'll stay in touch, but I'm really grateful for this.
Right on. Thanks, Matt.
Cheers, buddy. Ladies, gentlemen, that's it. That, again, Mitch Case from the Métis Nation of Ontario. Also, as you could tell there, a trained historian. Great to get him on the show. My thanks as well to Tristin Hopper, my first guest on this episode, who joined me to talk about his new book. Check out a copy. I'm going to put a link in the description here, so you have no excuse not to go buy a copy of Mitch's book. Want to just say thank you to obviously my guests, but also all of you guys for being part of On the Line. This is a programming note, guys. Our next episode of On the Line, we release them on Tuesdays, would have been coming out on Canada Day, and that's not going to happen. There will not be an On the Line episode for next week. There will, though, be one on July 8th. We'll be back to a normal publishing schedule after that. So have a great Canada Day. We will talk to you in 2 weeks. Check us out at readtheline.ca. Sign up for a free account there, and you'll get notifications every time we release anything. It's a great way to stay in touch with us. Many thanks to you. Many thanks, obviously, to my partner, Jen, who is my co-host here on the Line. Thanks to our sponsors, and thanks to you for listening. I will talk with you in July. This has been another episode of On the Line.